Hello friends and welcome back to another Web Developer Path video. Today we are going to start learning Laravel. So this is the last topic for our Web Developer Path. However, it is not the last video since Laravel is a huge framework and we can't cover everything in one video. So we will have as many videos as needed to cover as many features as we can. So let's have a quick introduction to Laravel. It is a PHP framework and it follows the MVC pattern, that is Model View Controller, which allows us to have a clean, organized code. It is also filled with built-in features. For example, they have their own template engine, which is called Blade, and we will learn about it today. And it is easy to use it with any front-end JavaScript framework. It has authentication and authorization built in. And we also have Eloquent ORM, which is object relational mapping, and that allows us to use our models to query our database and communicate with database, and also used in routing. We have our database migrations, which allows us to create our table schemas within our project. We have built-in validation that makes working with forms very easy, and we have many built-in rules that are quite useful. We also have mail and notification, file storage, job queues, and so many other features that we will explore as we go along. On top of all those built-in features, we also have a huge ecosystem that we can use in our Laravel project. For instance, if you are building a shopping site, you can use this package called Cashier. If you need a starter kit, you can use Breeze or Jetstream that comes in with a fully functional user registration system. And all these packages that we will explore some of them later on in future videos. So let's go back up and press get started and see how we can install a fresh new Laravel app on our machine. So there are a few ways to install a Laravel project, but I'm going to use Composer, which I find it easiest to work with. So we need to run this command, but before we do that, we need to have PHP, MySQL, and Composer installed on our machine. So if you are on Windows, I recommend using XAMPP, which comes in with Apache Server, database interface, which is phpMyAdmin, and also PHP itself. It is also available for Mac users, but I personally going to use Brew. So when you install XAMPP, make sure you start your Apache server and also MySQL. The next step is to install Composer. So again, for Windows users, you want to go to this installation section and you have this Composer executable file that you just have to run it and go through the installation. And for the Mac users, again, we will use Brew. Now for the database interface for Mac users, you can use Table Plus. I personally would use the terminal itself, but you could use Table Plus, which is a GUI, and there is a free version you can use. So if you open your command prompt or terminal, you can check for the programs and see if they are installed correctly or if you have them at all. So for PHP, you can just type php-v, and if that gave you a version number, that means it is ready and installed. For MySQL, you can just type mysql-u and then root, which is the default user with no password. So if that command gave you a version number and also the MySQL prompt, that means it is installed and you can now interact with MySQL database. And you can exit of this process by typing exit. For Composer, you can just type Composer, and if that gave you a version number and this logo, that means it is ready and installed. Now, if you don't have any of this, for Mac users, you can just use brew install and then name the package that you want to install, for instance, PHP or MySQL or even Composer. So all of these packages can be installed using brew command for Mac users. And there is an extra step for Mac users, much like Windows users that they have to start MySQL service using XAMPP. Mac users have to start MySQL service using Brew. So if you just type Brew services in your terminal, it shows you all the services that are running currently on your machine. For me, MySQL is already started, but if you had none in this status section, you can just type brew services start and then the name of the package. So in this case, we want to start MySQL. So when all of this is out of the way, we are ready to install a fresh new Laravel project, and we are going to use that Composer command. So back to the Laravel website, we want to copy this command and paste it here and just change the name. So let's call it first app. And when that is installed, we want to cd into that folder or project and first open it in VS Code by typing code space dot. So when you open your project in VS Code, you have a bunch of folders and files that we will go through them in a moment. Before we do that, I want to mention some of the extensions that I use, and they are quite useful. So if you just search Laravel in the extensions section, we have these extensions. The first one is Laravel Blade Snippets that I recommend to install it. The second one is Laravel Extra IntelliSense, and the last one is Laravel Blade Formatter. And for PHP, we have this PHP debug, PHP IntelliSense, and this PHP IntelliSense. So if you followed my PHP videos, you probably have these already. And those are the ones that I recommend. Now let's explore these folders and files. And we don't want to get into too much details about these files and folders. We just want to have a quick overview. And as we build our application or different parts of our app, we learn more and more about the structure and what do these files or folders do. All right, so we start with app, which is the core of our application, and it consists of few folders, and the one that we will work on today is HTTP. This consists of controllers and middlewares. So when we define a controller, that file would go to this folder automatically. And we have the exceptions and console, of course. These are just part of the Laravel, and we don't need to worry about it. We have our models, and Laravel ships in with a user model in the package. And that's because when you use a starter pack, they would use this user model and database migrations to create that user registration or authorization system in place. And we will explore these when we set up our application, but this is where we store our models. Then we have the providers, which are the service providers for different parts of our application. For instance, if we go to route service provider, we have this home and it is set to /home. So this is where you define the default home page of your application. Usually it's just a /, but Laravel by default chooses to pick home as the default home page. So later on, we will change this to a / or you can do it just now. And I will mention this later on. I will leave it as default for now because I want to show you what it does later on. Then we go to Bootstrap folder, which is in charge of bootstrapping our app, and we don't need to touch this folder at all. The config folder is where we have the configuration files for different parts of our application. For instance, the database configuration files, and by default, Laravel uses a MySQL database, and that's what we are going to use today. Then we have the database folder where we have factories, migrations, and seeders. Factories and seeders are in charge of filling our database with dummy data, and we will use this in future videos to fill our database with some data that we want to just have for local development. Then we have these migrations files inside the migrations folder that are basically the table schemas for our database. For instance, the first one that says create users table, that is table schema for the users table. And all of these migration files have an up method and a down method. The up method will create a table in our database with these columns. The down method will drop that table. And again, later on, we will create our own migration files to see how these works. But just by looking at these statements, we can understand that our users table would have an ID, a name, email, and some other columns. Let's move on to public folder, which is where we store all the public assets. And this index.php is the root of our application. And it's actually just a few lines of code, but this is the starter point of everything. And all the requests would go to this file before hitting any other file or folder in our app. We have our resources folder where we have CSS, JavaScript, and views. And these views are basically the pages that we will use in our application. And you notice the extension here is blade.php. So Blade, as I mentioned, is the template engine for Laravel, and the syntax is quite similar to Vue.js. We have double curly brackets to output or use dynamic data, and then we have directives. So we will learn about some of these as we go along. Then we have our routes folder, which consists of the routes for different parts or different applications that we are building. For instance, if we are building an API, we would use this file to define our route, or we have channels for broadcasting. We have console that allows us to create command line tools, and web, which is where we define our web app routes. And we will use this one today since we are building a web app. And by default, we have one route already, which is going to /, which is homepage, and it is returning a view. And that view is coming from resources views folder and this welcome view is the one we are returning here. All right, next we have a storage where we store all the media files like pictures, videos, and music and so on. And then we have tests and vendors. So we don't need to touch these at all. Test is obviously for testing, and vendors is where all the dependencies are sitting. So we don't need to touch these folders at all. And among these files, we have only one that we need to work on, and that is env. This is where we store all the environment variables and information about our website or any sensitive data that we don't want to share publicly. For instance, we have our database connection information. So this is where we define our database connection, the host port, and the name, and so on. So later on, we will come here and change the database name, or if we had a user and a password, we would also provide it here. We also have mailer information. If we were sending emails to our users, this is where we would define the mailer information and some other information that we don't need to worry about it at this time. As we build our application, we will see how these things work. So that is just a quick overview of a Laravel app folder structure. All right, next, we want to open our project in a browser and see what we have. If we go back to our terminal and just run PHP Artisan, and you see it gives us bunch of commands that we can run, and each of these commands perform an action for our project. If we scroll all the way to the top, we have our Laravel framework version and also the available commands and options for us. For instance, this H flag is very useful and we will use it all the time to see what these commands do. But the one that we want to use right now is this serve command that will serve the application on PHP development server so we can see it in our browser. So let's run PHP Artisan serve. This will give us a URL which we can copy and just paste it inside the browser. So this is our fresh Laravel app. We just have a logo and few cards and the Laravel version down here. And these are all coming from this welcome template. So if we delete everything here and let's just say hello, and if we go back here and refresh the site, we have that text, of course. So let's see how Blade works. I'm going to start with a simple HTML file here. Just add an H1 and just some text. So this is our website right now. So for the start, let's just stick with PHP. Let's ignore this Blade extension. And normally we would open our PHP tags on top of the document, and we would have our statements up here, our PHP statements. Let's say I have a name variable and that is set to the value of a string, that is John. And if I wanted to output it down here inside the markup, I would have to again open those PHP tags and echo that variable. So we would, of course, get that value on the screen. However, this is just one line. And imagine if you had thousands of lines of code and you wanted to have a fully dynamic website, this can be quite difficult and cumbersome. Now, this is where Blade comes in. So the first thing is to output dynamic data. So this is our dynamic variable, and we want to output it in the markup. We can use double curly brackets, just like Vue.js, and then provide the name of the variable. In this case, we called it name. So this does the same thing, but our code is much cleaner. We also have directives in Blade, and all the directives start with an @ sign and then the name. For instance, we have a PHP directive, and we need to open the tag and then end it with an end statement like this. So I'm going to delete this for a moment, and I just want to show you, if you just type the name of a directive, for instance, PHP, this extension, Laravel Blade Snippets, will help you to open and close those tags, or basically give you the boilerplate. Anyway, I'm going to move this inside these PHP directives and save it, and we still see the same thing. So this is one way. We could, of course, bind our attributes to dynamic data as well. Let's say I have a variable here, call it my CSS, and I just want to add color to my text. On this H1, if I provide the style attribute, instead of hard coding this color, I want to use this my CSS. So again, inside these quotations, I can open the curly brackets and just pass the name that I want to use. In this case, it's my CSS. Sorry, I noticed I have two equal signs here, so I'm going to delete one of them, and I got an error here. So give it a refresh, we get our text, which is red. And so you can see how Blade is quite useful. Let's explore some other directives. Let's say I have a variable here and call it isShow, and I want to set it to false. We can have if statements, just like any if statements, and we can provide the opening and closing directives, and inside these parentheses we will have our condition. I want to check if isShow is true. I want to, for instance, just say show the menu. I'm going to get rid of this one. So if I refresh, of course we don't see anything, because this is false. Now, in order to have an else block, we can just add at else and maybe copy this h1 and paste it down here and just show this one. For example, a text that says close the menu. So now we see that text because the condition is false up here, and therefore we see the else block. So that's quite simple. We also have another directive which is the opposite of this if statement, and that is unless. So if I provide the same logic here and the same text, is show variable, right now it's false, right? And back to our website and refresh, we see the first text that says show the menu and then the second one that says close the menu. First one is coming from here because this condition checks if something is false, but this condition checks if something is true. So unless is the opposite way of this if statement. Of course, we could do the same thing here by just negating this condition, and this will give us this text 2 times. There we go. We also have loops. So if we just add a for loop here, and that extension gives us the boilerplate, we have our iterator, we have the rounds or how many times we want it to go on, and then we are adding 1 to that variable or incrementing it. So if I just have that h1 again, and maybe this time I want to say, so num is this I, whatever the number is. So if we refresh our site, we get 0 through 4. We also have other directives that we can't see a practical example of it just now because we don't have anything in place, but we have directives for authentication. For instance, this auth directive checks if the user is authenticated or logged in, then it will render whatever we pass in here. And similar to this one, we have guest. So this will render this text to the guest users. If I change these texts, we can test it. We will see only this part, like so. And later on, when we create our authentication system, we will use these directives to achieve the result we want. So again, we will learn more and more about bullet template and directives as we go along. For now, I'm going to delete everything and just add an h1 with some text so we have something on the screen, and also get rid of this PHP tags on top. So the next part I want to cover is routes. And if we go to routes folder, under web.php, we have one route. So in order to define routes in Laravel, we use the route class, which extends the facade abstract class. Now you can explore these other classes by control clicking on these directories or these other classes to see what they are. But we don't have to worry about it. These are just names or different ways of Laravel handling things behind the scenes. We just have to use the route class here and then use one of the static methods that is available to us. So we have our HTTP methods like get, post, delete, put, and patch, and we have a bunch of other ones that we will explore as we go along. So this get method, that is a static method on the route class, takes 2 arguments. The first one is the URI or the path that we want to use, and the second one is the actions. So basically, this second argument is the handler for this path. And in this case, we are returning a view that is called welcome. So this view is a helper function in Laravel that returns a view. And by default, it looks inside the resources folder and then views folder. And that's why we don't have to write the relative path to this view. We just have to provide the name without the extension. Let's change the name of this welcome view to home and see what happens. So right now this is called home, and in here we are returning welcome. So of course we will get an error in our website, but I want to talk about this error we get. This is a debug tool from Laravel, and it is very useful because it tells you where the error is coming from. And also, in most cases, it gives you a suggestion. If it can resolve the problem, it tells you what you might be able to do to fix the problem. And in this case, it recognizes that the welcome view doesn't exist, but there is a view called home. So they give us this message. And this debug tool is available to us because right now in our env file, the environment we are working is local and the debug tool is set to true. If we were to deploy this app, we should set this to production and this one to false. So anyway, we want to change this to home, and of course our website is back to normal. So I'm going to get rid of this comment and create another route just as an example. So we want to grab the route class and use the get method again. This time for the URI, I want to go to /about, and for the action, we are going to do the same thing as above. We want to have a function that would return a view. Right now, we don't have the view, so I'm just going to leave it empty as it is. Let's create a folder in our views folder, and I'm going to call it pages. This is just a test. We are not going to keep any of this. And inside the pages, I'm going to have a document and call it about index.blade.php. And in fact, it doesn't have to be Blade. So I'm going to delete that. Just want to show you it works. And in this one, we will have just an H1 that says about. So in this view function, we want to pass this about page. Now, like I said, this view is automatically looking inside this view folder. However, it's not going to look inside the other pages. So if we just pass about here, it's not going to work. So if we go to /about, we get this error. So instead of passing about, which doesn't exist in the views folder, we need to say it's inside the pages, then about. With dot notation, we can navigate between folders. So now if we give it a refresh, the about page works. So that was just a test, and I'm going to delete these pages folder, also this route, and stick with the home page and just see what we can do. So back in the home page, let's say you have a search form and you submit the search form and the query is added to the URL. And for instance, it goes like this. So we would have a question mark and then name equals to John. So that name is the key and equal to John, that is the value. So in order to get the values out of the URL, we need to use the request class. And if you just type request inside this function, we have a few requests. The one that we want and we need to work with is this HTTP, not the client, but this HTTP right here. And it needs to be imported, and then we want to accept it as a parameter for our function. Then we want to see what does this request give us. Now in Laravel, we have a very useful function that is called dd, that is die and debug. And if we pass anything in this function, it will kill the process and nothing after this dd will run. Right now, if I refresh this site, we get that OK. We don't even return that view. So instead of this OK, let's output the request object up here and see what we get. So if we give it a refresh, we have all these information available to us. And if we check our query here, we have an array with one element in it that is an associative array where the key is what we provided up here and the value is coming from a search form, for instance. And of course, we have other information like the method, like the URL, and if we were submitting a form with a post request, we would have it inside this request object. So let's see how we can grab this name. It is as easy as just chaining the value we want to grab. On this request object, we can directly call the name, and if we refresh our site, we get the value, which is again coming from up here. So if we change this to anything, let's say Mike, we get Mike, of course. So we will get to work with request when we make our registration form and we grab the data out of a form using this request object. So this is reading from the URL and grabbing it inside our action or handler. Let's see how we can do it the opposite way. So we want to send some data to our view, and this view function takes a second argument, which is an array of data. So if we just pass an array here and we want to use an associative array, let's say I want to have a title variable and set it to my first app. Now let's see how we can grab this in our view, which is our home view. So let's go back there, and it is very easy. We just have to create our curly brackets and just grab that variable. So using the key that we provided here, we call it title, and therefore we can just use title here with this $, of course, because it's a dynamic variable, and save it. And let's get rid of this dd because we will not be able to see this with this dd in place. So if we refresh the site, we see that my first app, which is coming from here. And in fact, we could just pass this request name, and let's create another one. So we have a title, and then I want to have a name that is set to request name. So we want to grab the name out of the URL and then pass it to the view. So let's save it and go back to our home. We want to say hello. This time we grab the name. So back to our website. Let's give it a refresh. We see hello Mike because up here we said Mike. If we say John, we see hello John. So that's how we can pass data to our view or read from the view and handle it in our function. Now going back to this dd method, there is also a DDD method, so 3Ds, and that is die, dump, and debug, I believe. So if we refresh the site, we get this debugging tool view that is just giving us more information about what's happening and where is this page or error is coming from. And we have all this information available to us that we can just explore and see what's going on. So as I mentioned, this route class has a lot of static methods available. And one of the useful ones is a view method. For instance, let's say we have this function here that is just returning the home view, okay? So we don't need this request object. We don't need any of those data. I'm going to delete all of this. And And in our Blade template also, I'm going to delete these because they don't exist and it will give us an error if we don't get rid of them. So right now we are just returning a view, right? That's all we are doing here. And instead of passing it like this with a function, we can use a view method. So instead of get, we can just say view. And this view method takes the URI, which is / for us, and then the view. So in this case, we just want to say home. So that function is translated just to this simple statement. Now back in our website, if we refresh, we still see that hello, but you can see how clean and simple this is. We can even pass our data if we wanted to using this view function. So as a third argument, we could pass an array and just pass the data we want to pass to our view. So we don't have to again create that function. So now I can grab the name here, and if we refresh the site, we get that value. All right, I'm going to delete this again and keep the home view as simple as just a view. So that is a quick, simple overview of routes. Next, we want to talk about models and migration files for a bit. Then we will get to creating our actual app. All right, so if we go to app and models, we have this user model that ships out with Laravel project. And we don't have to worry about all these imports or classes, but when we create a model using an artisan command, we would have the necessary classes or namespace automatically imported for us. And we will do that in a moment. But the one that I want to talk about is this fillable array here. So this fillable array, as this comment says, is the attributes that needs to be filled because our database needs these names. And if we check the database folder under migrations, the first one that says create users table, you notice in this create method where we create a users table, we are specifying that the name, email, and password are necessary. And we have this other field, but as it says here, it can be null. So it is not required. But for now, you don't have to worry about these types. Later on, we will create our own schema and we will see the types that are available to us. So this is just creating a table and we are setting the criteria for that column. For example, the name should be a string. And if we don't say nullable, that means it is required. Anyway, we are saying we need name, email, and password. And because we are providing this fillable array in our model, we are saying that it needs to be filled from some other source. But to have a better example, let's see how we can create our own model. So let's go back to terminal and I'm going to create a new tab or duplicate it rather. Just run PHP artisan command once again. As I mentioned, this gives you a lot of commands that you can run to build different parts for your application or perform certain actions. And if we look under the make section, we have all these commands that will make something for our app. For instance, we have make model. So this make model will create a new model class for us. Let's run PHP artisan make model and use that h flag, see what we get. This will create a new model for us. It expects a name and it can accept options. Now we are not going to use any of these options today, but later on we will see, for instance, this a flag that will create all the necessary parts of a model for us. And most of the time, when you are building a real application, you would need a migration, a seeder, a factory, a policy, and a controller, that's for sure. And using an A flag, we don't have to worry about any of these parts and they will be created for us automatically. And in fact, we will use it in the future videos when we want to create our posts class. So let's create a model and give it a name. And this is again just a test. We are not going to use it. And I want to call it post. So when we run this command, it will create a post model class in that directory. And in our app, now we have this post.php, and you notice the boilerplate that we have here. We have our namespace, we have the classes that we need to use already imported for us. This is where we would have our fillable array. We would have to create something similar to users. So if I copy this, paste it here, and we would just add the columns that need to be filled in here. So for instance, we would say title and body. So this is necessary because Laravel uses ORM, which is object relational mapping. And later on, we would use this post or user to create or find or, make database queries. For instance, imagine right now we are inside a controller. So this is inside of a controller and we want to create post, right? So we would say post : create, which is a static method available on the class. And this create takes an array where these values need to be filled. So of course, again, these are just example, and later on we will create a user and we will follow this example. Let's delete this post and let's talk about migration files a bit. So under database migrations, we have these 4 migration files. And in fact, we don't need to worry about the last 3 documents. The first one is the one that we want to talk about. But all of them are quite similar. They all have an up method and a down method, and they just create a different table for us in our database, which we don't have just now. But to explore our create users table migration file, we have this up method. There is a schema class that will create the users table for us and a callback function that will define the columns for that table. And using this blueprint class, we are able to define different types of our column or define the criteria for our columns. Let's go back to Laravel documentation. And if we look at the left side, there's a database section and we have migrations here. And under columns, we have this available column types. And you can see we have all these different types available for our columns, like string, text, long text, and a bunch of others. We also have our index types, which is primary, unique, full text, and so on. So of course, we don't want to cover everything here, but I would recommend coming to this documentation as often as you can, because it's always showing you the information you need, but also the proper way to implement something. So back to our project, we have the up method, of course, and the down method, which will simply drop a table. And this will be used when we run a PHP artisan command to migrate or roll back a migration. So let's do this in action. First, we are going to create our own migration file and see how that works. So back in terminal, let's run PHP artisan again. If we check under make, we have make migration that will create a new migration files, just like users table. And there's actually a pattern to name your migration files. So let's say PHP artisan make migration, and let's use the edge flag first. And of course, it will create a migration file. It needs the name, and there are these flags. You could be specific about everything using these flags, but using a pattern, you don't have to do any of this. So if we just run PHP artisan make migration and then use this pattern, just like the user table, we want to say create posts table. So if we name it this way, Laravel will understand we are trying to create a table that is called posts. So we don't have to use these flags anymore. And if we just press enter, it will create the migration files inside that folder. So back in our project, now we have a new file that has an up method and a down method where we say we want to create a posts table. And by default, we have an ID and a timestamp. So here we could define the columns for our post table. And we could grab the table instance. And let's just say I want a title of type string. So we specify the type, and this will take the column name. We want to call it title. So we could, for instance, say this field or this column could be empty. So we could just say it is nullable. But anyway, these are just tests. And next, we want to run our migrations and set up our database to see what we get in our database. So if you open your database interface, and if you are on Windows, you can use phpMyAdmin. If you are on Mac, you could use that table plus, but I'm just going to use terminal. It's easier to see and work with. So I just have to say mysql-u root. And if we use a show databases command here, it will show us the databases that are already available to us. So for instance, I have this DemoDB that I used before, and I can drop it using drop database. So I don't want it. So I just want to say DemoDB, and this will get rid of that database for me. So I have these 4 default ones. And if you haven't used MySQL before, you probably have these 4 as well. And next, we want to create a database. Again, if you are using an interface like my phpMyAdmin, there is a create database button. And if you follow my PHP videos, we go through all of this in the PHP videos. And if you are on Mac, after you are connected to your database using MySQL, you will have an empty window probably, and you just have to press Command K to select a database or create a new one. So we want to create a database. And again, I'm going to call it DemoDB. Now the database is created and we have this name here. We can go back to our project and inside the env file. So the database we are using is MySQL. The host and the port are the same. We don't need to change any of this. We just have to change the name to DemoDB or whatever name you used. And again, if you have a username and password, make sure you add it here. All right, so that's all we have to do. And let's go back to terminal. And I'm going to create a new tab here because I want to keep my SQL tab open and run PHP Artisan again. We need to run this command, migrate. So let's do that. And this command will fill our database with these tables. So we have 5 migration files, therefore we have 5 tables. Let's go back to MySQL or your interface. So we want to switch to that database first, DemoDB, and then show all the tables. So now we have these tables, and you notice we have posts and users. So if we take a look at our posts table, you see we have our ID title and the timestamp, which created 2 columns for us, the created and updated at. So of course we don't want this, we want to delete it. Let's go back to PHP artisan commands, and if we check under migrate section, we have these commands available to us. So we have fresh that will drop all the tables and rerun all migrations. We have install, refresh, reset, rollback, and so on. So if we run this rollback, let's do that, see what happens. So we want to say migrate rollback. It will roll back the migrations, of course. And if we check our MySQL database again, there are no tables except this one, migrations. This is the default table that will keep track of the migrations that we have already run. That rollback uses this down method to drop the tables if the last migration was to create it. So this rollback command, it will roll back the last migration, not all of them. Now let's make some changes in our application. So we don't need this post migration. I'm going to delete it. And let's run our migrations again. So back in our terminal, I'm going to just run PHP artisan migrate. This will create the tables without the posts because we deleted it. And if we go back to MySQL and just show the tables, we have users. Now, if we check out users and see what we have. We have the name, email, and password, but I don't want name. I want username. So I can change this to username, and make sure you change this in the user's model as well, because this fillable array should match your migration file and the columns that are necessary to be filled. And I'm going to keep it like this. So in the user model, we change the name to username, and in the migration file for users table, we change the name to username as well. Let's go back to terminal. Now, we already have these tables and we want to change this to username. So we have to drop everything and start over. So we can just run migrate fresh. So this migrate fresh command will drop all the tables and it will create them again. So back to MySQL, let's inspect the users table again. Now we have username. All right, so that is about migrations, and I think it's time to start building our application. So our database is set up. We want to actually create a registration form and let users register, log in, and log out. And that is what we are going to do for this video. And in the future videos, we will have other models and migrations so we can integrate it or we can link it with users. All right, so we want to start in resources, views, because I want to create a layout file that would share among all the other pages. That just makes sense. We don't want to repeat this head tag on every page. So inside the views folder, let's create another folder and call it layouts. Then inside that folder, I'm going to create a file and call it main.blade.php. So let's create the head tags here. And for the title of our app, let's say we want to use this one, this app name. We could actually use the env helper function and get the dynamic name out of the env file. So we could just use the double curly brackets and just use env and then pass the name of that variable. In this case, we want the app name. Then we want to have our navigation here. So let's create a header tag and a nav tag, and let's just say navigation for now, and a main tag. So this is where a placeholder should go. And in order to have a placeholder, in Laravel, there is a directive called yield. And this yield takes a name. Let's give it a name content. So this is our placeholder. And now we can include or inject other files inside these main tags. So let's see how we can do that. Back to our home template. I want to delete everything here. And the first step is to extend our main using an extend directive. So we need to pass the name of this layout file, which is inside a layouts folder. So if we get rid of these quotations and just provide them again, the Laravel extension will help us and recognize this layouts main blade component. So we need to go inside the layouts folder and then the main file. So that's the first step. And then we need to specify where does this home page need to go. So we want it to go inside the main tags in place of that yield with the name of content. We can use a section directive, which will take the name of that yield. And if I just, let's say welcome and save it. Now this welcome text should go inside this main tag. So if we refresh our site, we get navigation text. We also get the welcome text. And up here, we have Laravel for the title because we said get it from the env. And of course, if we inspect this site, we have our main tag, which has that h1 within it. You can have as many sections as you want and use different names. Now, this is the simple way. There is actually a proper component in Laravel where we can create using a PHP artisan command, and we don't have to do any of this. But I think that is going too fast for this video, so we will just stick with this approach. And now we want to style our website. And I'm going to use Tailwind, but I want to show you how you can use plain CSS if you wanted to. So by default, we have this app.css, which is empty. And I just want to add some styles so we can see the difference. So I want to say all the H1s should be red. Now, in order to link that app and use it in the head tag, we need to use a Vite directive. Since Laravel ships out with Vite, in the older versions, we had Laravel Mix, but now they use Vite. So we can use a Vite directive, and this will take the relative path to the asset that we want to use. We want to use that app.css. So we want to go inside the resources folder, then CSS, then app.css. All right, so now we are using this Vite directive, but this is not going to work. Let's refresh the site and see what we get. We get this exception that says run npm dev because Vite is part of Node and JavaScript, so we have to install our Node dependencies and also run this command. So let's go back to terminal, and on this third tab, I'm going to first install the dependencies using npm i. When that is done, we want to run npm run dev. So the good thing about this is that we don't have to refresh our site every time that we make a change, because Vite now is watching our project for changes, and it will apply those changes when we save our project. So let's go back there and maybe create an H1 inside the nav. We already have an H1 on the home page, but just to show you, I want to save this and refresh. We get that text and a text from homepage. So if I change this to hello and go back to the website, it's already there. I don't need to refresh the site anymore. And if you want to use plain CSS, you can add it right here. As I mentioned, I'm going to use Tailwind. So let's go to Tailwind website. We want to go to installation section and then framework guides and then Laravel. So as I mentioned, they used to have Laravel Mix. Now they use Vite. So we want to make sure that we are under the Vite section, and we just want to copy these commands back to the terminal. I'm going to break this process and paste those commands. And while that is running, I'm going to copy these texts from the Tailwind website. And back to our project, we should have this Tailwind config now that we can paste those texts inside the content array. So we can close it now. And the next part is to bring the directives. So we can just copy these directives from Tailwind website and paste it here. So if we run npm run dev again, our changes should be applied now. So back to our website, we have our Tailwind classes already in place. And I just want to copy these classes from our Mern stack videos. So these are just some custom Tailwind classes that I don't want to repeat. That's why I'm just copying from here. And I can paste them inside this app.css and make some changes. Padding x3, padding y1. Then on the input, I don't need this margin bottom. And then I want to add error class. So I don't have to come back here. So just some small text that is red. Okay, so I can close this one. All right, so for our header, let's add some classes. So we want to say some background, and the text should be white. And on the nav itself, we want to add flex, items center, justify between, and some padding. And I also wanted to center it. So I can say max width, it should be screen, let's say large, and MX auto. So instead of this H1, I will have an anchor tag that would be home, and this home tag will have nav link class. Then I'm going to copy it and create a div. Inside this div, I will paste that nav link 2 times. We will have a link for login and register. And on this div wrapper, I will have flex item center and some gap. On the main tag itself, we also want to have some padding 8. I think that's all we need. So let's check out our website, and there we go. So back to the project, I'm just going to copy these two classes and paste them on the main tag. All right, so let's go to the home page and add the title class to our H1. So that's what we have. We want to start with register page first, because if we don't have a user, we can't log in. And first, let's create the view for it. So inside the views folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it auth. Inside that folder, we will have register.blade.php. So I'm going to grab everything from homepage and just paste it here. Just change this title to create a new account. So let's leave it as it is for now and create the route for it, because right now we can't see it since we don't have a route. Let's go to web.php, and we already know how to do this. We want to grab the route and use the get method here and then pass the URI. We want to go to /register and then pass a function here. For now, we just want to pass a function in line and just return the view so we can see something on the screen. But we want to create a controller for this. For now, let's just leave it as it is, and let's go to /register, and we see our page, of course. So let's see how we can create a controller and get this function out of this routes file. So again, we want to go to our terminal, and I'm going to create yet another tab. So right now I have 4 tabs, and one of them is PHP Artisan Serve, one of them is MySQL, one of them is npm dev or Vite, and this last one is where I want to run my commands. So let's run PHP Artisan once again, and under make section we have make controller. So let's run that one with an H flag. So this will create a controller class for us, and we have to give it a name. And we also have these options, but let's create a fresh plain controller, and we want to create it inside another folder. Now in the command line or terminal, if you want to have folders, you can name the folder and use // to go inside that folder. So we want to say register controller inside that auth folder, and this will create register controller.php. All right, so now in our project, if we go under app, HTTP controllers, we have this auth folder and it has our register controllers in it. So we want to move this function out of the routes file and into our controller. So I cut it from there and paste it here. So you notice when you create a controller, it will automatically brings in the necessary parts that you might need. And this is a simple one. It's not even a resource one. We have our request class already imported, and it is automatically extending the base controller class. Anyway, we need to make some changes here. So we need to fix this function. We need to make it public and also give it a name. And by convention, it's called index. And that's all for our controller. So we don't need to change this part. Now, back in our route, we need to tell this get method to use that controller. Instead of passing a function here, we can pass an array. And the first element in this array is the class itself we want to use. So we want to pass the name of our class. So we called it register controller. So we want to use the class itself, and this is the syntax we need to use. The second element in this array is the method that is going to handle that GET request. Now you notice VS Code is giving me this autocomplete. This is kind of the old ways, or the other way, maybe not the old way. And you could use it this way. So you could pass a string that goes inside that controller and this @ sign and then the name of the method. So this would do the same thing, but I think this array approach is cleaner. So we just have to say index here. All right. So in other words, we are saying when a user goes to /register with a get method, the index method inside the register controller should handle that request. So let's go back to our website and we would still see the same thing, but now the logic is inside this controller. So now let's address these links, because right now they're not going anywhere. So let's go back to our project, and in our main layout, we want to go to / for home and /register for registered. And of course, we can hard code this like this. That would work. But I think the better practice is to name your routes and then use the route helper function to navigate. So to name our routes, we can simply chain the name method to our route and then give it a name. So in this case, I want to call it home. And that's all we have to do. So we want to do the same thing for register. So let's say name, and I'm going to call it register. That's it. Now, the benefit of this is that you can call this route from anywhere using the route helper function. And even if you change the URI, you don't have to worry about it because you are calling it by the name and not by the URI. So let's go to the main layout, and instead of hard coding the text, we want to use double curly brackets and use the route helper function and just pass the name of the route. Same thing for register. We want to use the route and register. So now in our project, if we go to home, we are back to home page and register and so on. So let's create our register form. We want to go to register blade PHP and create a form. So for the action of the form, we want to use that route helper function again. And our register route is going to handle it. This is the first part. And the method is going to be post, of course, because we want to submit some information to our database. Right now, the route exists, but it doesn't exist on this method. So if we submit it, we will get an error. And we will create the route in a moment. But the name is the same. The method is different. So let's create our input fields. I want an input. The class that I'm going to use is input. And the placeholder, I want to say username. Also give it a name username. So these names will be used when we use the request object and want to grab the values of these inputs. And these names are actually coming from our user model. So remember, in our user model, this fillable array is expecting a username, an email, and password. So we need to have these fields in our form. So that's the first one, and I'm going to copy it, just paste it down here 3 more times. And for the second one, we want an email, and the name should be email, and I'm keeping type as text, and I will explain later why. Then for the third and fourth one, we want password as type. The placeholder should be password for the first one, and the other one should be confirm password, and the name, of course, password for this field, which is the third in our form. And the last one, it should be password underscore confirmation. And this is a specific rule in Laravel. And I will explain this when we get to validation. So let's see how this looks. So this is our form. Let's apply some classes to these divs, which I forgot. So margin bottom 6. Maybe 4, 6 is too much. Let's have a button that just says register with the class of btn, and on the form itself I'm going to add max width screen medium, mx auto. See how this looks. So this is our form, and I'm not really concerned about the CSS, so we just want to keep it simple. Now, of course, if we submit the form, we would get this error because that post route doesn't exist. So let's go back to our project, and to the routes, we want to create a post route. So this time, instead of get, we want to say post. The URI is the same, and the method that is going to handle it is coming again from register controller, and we want to call it create. We are creating a user. Now, we don't need to name this route because Laravel will resolve the name by this get method. So it will look at this URI and it sees that they match. Therefore, it uses the same name for it. So let's create this method in our controller. So let's just copy this and paste it down here. Get rid of this statement, call this create, and let's die and dump. Okay. So we expect to get this die and dump when we press register. Let's see what happens when we submit the form. We get 419 page expired. So this is part of the security measures of Laravel. And in Laravel, all the forms with a post request must have a CSRF token. And that is basically just a random generated string that is used for security and against cross-site attacks. And all we have to do to resolve this problem, add a CSRF token using this directive. So again, all the forms with a post request must have this directive, otherwise it's not going to work. So back to our register page, if we inspect our form, we have our own input fields, but now we have a hidden input field that is called a token, and it has this random value. So this is, again, Laravel handling everything behind the scene, and we don't have to worry about it. So now if we register, we get that OK. So the next part is validation. Let's see how we can validate these input fields. I'm going to close these extra files we don't need. So in our register controller, we want to register the users, but before that, we want to validate them, then register, then log in, and then redirect. So there are multiple ways to validate the user input. But I think one easy way is to grab this class using the this keyword, and there is a validate method available to us on this keyword, which is basically this class. Now this validate method takes the request object as its first parameter. So we need to accept it up here. So we want to say request, which is already imported here when we created our controller, and it's from HTTP. We want to create an instance of it and then pass it inside this validate function as its first argument. And the second argument is an array, or rather an associative array with all the rules. But before we do this, let's just die and dump the request object once again. So we did this before when we had a query in our URL, but let's see how it works with the form. So I'm going to just add some data here and just press register. So we get this object with attributes, request, and so on. So if we check request up here, we have this array of 5 elements where we have our token, username, email, and password, and so on. So again, much like what we did with the query, we can just say, for instance, I want the email. And if we resubmit the form, we get that email. All right, so let's move this back down here so we can validate our data. So like I said, this is an associative array, and the key here is the name of our input field. So we want to validate the username field, and the rules that we can apply are found in Laravel documentation. Let's go there for a moment. Under basics, we have validation, and then we have available validation rules, and you can see there is a load of these validation rules, like email. If you want to make sure an email is a proper email, we have required, which means, of course, the field must have some value. So we can pass these rules as a text, separate them using a pipe. So I want to say this username is required, and the maximum characters that I expect is 255, just like our database. So this is fine and it works, but there is another way to do this, and that is passing an array. So I prefer this way, which I think it's cleaner. So we want to say username is required and the maximum character is 255. So that's our first field. Then we have our email, which is again required, and this has to be an email, a valid email address. And there is another validation for this email we want to apply, but we will get back to it later. Then we want to validate our password. So password is required, and also the password should be confirmed. Let's talk about this confirmed rule. If we go back to the documentation, we have confirmed right here. You notice that says the field under validation must have a matching field of the name of the field, whatever that was, and then underscore confirmation. So we called our field password. Therefore, the confirmation field should be password underscore confirmation. Back in our template, if we called this field secret, then this should be secret underscore confirmation. And Laravel automatically looks at these two fields and see if they have a matching value. If not, it will throw an error. That is all done by this one word. So for the email, I want to add a maximum value as well, but there is yet another rule that I want to apply. And I'm not applying it just now because I want to show you the error when it's not applied. Anyway, so these are the rules, but we don't have any feedback on our page. So back in our website, if we try to submit the form with these values, we don't get anything and the data is gone. So we don't get that die and dump because the validation fails, but we don't see any feedback. So when these validations fails, Laravel gives us an error state, and we can grab it in our template by using an error directive. So right under the input field that we want to show the error, we want to use the error directive, and this error directive takes the name of the input field under validation, in this case username. And in this error state or this error object, we have a message already available to us, and we just have to output it using these curly brackets. And I just want to add the error class to this p tag. Okay, so a side note, so if you got an error regarding your CSS, that's because when I was creating this error class, I used text small like this, which is not correct. It should be text sm. So make sure you change that one and the error should be gone. And now if we register, we see our error message with that red text. So this is all done using this simple directive here. We can even have conditional classes here. Right now we have only one class. Let's say I want to have a red border like this. Ring red 500. Right now it is red because we are not making it conditional. But if we just wrap it with these error state or error directives, just like that, then we will have a red border when there is an error. And you notice it's all inside these quotations. So now if we just register, the border is red and we get our error message. So let's just copy paste this for other fields. We want to do the same thing for email. Just make sure you change the name. And also for the border, right after the input, we want to say email again here. And for the password, so I'm just going to select both of them and paste and change this to password. And then this error state or error message right under password input field, We want to say password, and that's it. Now for the password and confirm password, we don't need to apply this error directive to the confirm password because they are technically the same. And if there is an error with any of them, this error message will be shown here because the field under validation is in fact the password. And I just added this red border for the confirm password. So if there is an error, both of them would have a red border, but the message will be only on the password field itself. So again, I made a mistake here. This should be password. That was a typo. All right, now let's press register. So we get our error messages as well as the red borders. Now you notice we said the type of our input field should be text. And that's because if we provide an email that is not a proper email and press register, we get this message: email field must be a valid email address. If we change the type to email and type something here that is not a proper email, then we get this message. So we don't get our Laravel error messages. We just get this, front-end browser handled error, which is kind of annoying because we want to show message for all the other fields as well. So we will leave it as text. Now, the other thing is that if we provide some information here, which is correct, but the password, let's say it's not correct. We press register, we get this error for the password, but we lost our old values even though it was correct. So in order to solve this issue, we can just use another helper function in Laravel. For the fields that we want to keep the value, we can use the value attribute. And then inside curly brackets, we want to use this old function that would take the name of the input field. So we want to keep the old value for username. So we just say old username. Now I'm going to copy this, paste it for email, and change that text to email. Now, if we provide some information and a wrong password, you can see that those information are still there. So the user doesn't have to go retype them if they make a mistake. So of course, we could add more rules here. For instance, the password can be 1 character or it could be 100. It doesn't really matter. So we can specify min or max. So let's say I want my password to be minimum 3 characters or 6 or things like that. So we can do that. And I want to also mention that there is also a password class available for us, which is under validation. So not this one, which is under facade, but this one that is under validation. And this password class has some static methods available to it, like the default, the minimum, the required, and things like that. Again, these are all available in Laravel documentation. So now if we try to register with a password that is less than 3 characters, we see that message that says it must be at least 3 characters. All right, so we are almost completely done with our form. So if we actually provide some valid data here and register, we get to that die and dump. And the next step is to actually register a user. Using ORM or object relational mapping, we can easily use our model to create an instance of it and save it into our database. So in order to register a user, we just have to use the user class that needs to be imported from models. And then we have a create method available on that model that it takes an array. And in this array, we can pass the required field, which are username, email, and password. So we can say email is request email. Remember, this is giving us the email from the form. So we can just pass it down here. Let's keep the order right. So we want the username first. The order doesn't really matter, but I just want to keep it consistent. Now for the password, we don't want to just save the password as plain text, of course. We want to hash this password and then save it into our database, because right now this will create the user with the password that they entered into the form. So to hash a password is quite easy. So I'm going to cut this and use the hash facade that we need to import it up here. So it's from support facade hash. And we have a make method available to us. So this will take the value we want to hash. That's it. This is all we have to do to hash a password. So let's see if this is successful. And if it is, we should see this message. Let's go to our website, bring back our form. Let's create this John user. And I want to say 321 321. So we get our die and dump, which means we should have an entry in our database. So let's go back to MySQL. And if you are using terminal like me, you can just say select star from users. So we have this John user and the email and the password, which is hashed, and then the date that it was created. So we have this. Now I want to mention that rule about email that we haven't applied yet. So let's go to our database migration and the user migration file. You notice that email has this unique rule to it, right? This is part of our table schema. So if we try to register with the same email again, the database would not be happy about it. If we press register, we get this error that says we are duplicating an entry. We are not handling this uniqueness of email field in our template, and that's why we are getting this error. So in production, this would be a poor design. So among these rules, we have another rule that is unique. So this unique rule is looking for the table and the column and some other information. Now, since the input field that we are using is the same name as our column in our database, we just have to specify the table. Now, if the names were different, then we had to specify the column as well. But because the input field has the same name as the column in our database, we just have to say this is related to the users table and the column is called email. So let's try this again. And I want to register with the same email address and press register. We say this email has already been taken. So now we addressed that issue. We are able to register the user. And the next part, we just want to log in the user, which is quite easy. So in order to log in the user, we can use the auth facade. We import it again from the facades, and we have a login function available to us. So this function expects a valid user object. And since we are already creating a user up here, we are using our user model, right? So it will give us a valid user object. We can just save it inside a variable and pass it down here. That's all we have to do to log in the user. Now for the last part, which is redirect, we want to return a redirect, which is a helper function, and we can chain a route function to this and just pass the name. So we want to redirect to home, and we can just delete this die and dump. So that is all we have to do to register a user. So I'm going to delete the users from my users table by saying delete from users. So right now I have empty users table and I want to create this user again. So 321, press register, and we are back to home page, but there's no indication that we are logged in. So let's go back to the home page. And remember, we talked about auth and guest directives. So we can use them here. So inside the home page, I want to create an auth directive and copy this H1 and paste it here. I want to show the authenticated username after this welcome text. So we can use the auth helper function within our template, and this will tell us if the user is authenticated or not. And on that auth helper, we have a user function that will give us the current authenticated user, and we want to grab the username. So this will say welcome John or Mike or something like that. Then we want to show another text if the user is not logged in. In this case, we want to create a guest directive and say hello user. So right now you can see it says welcome John, and we don't have any logout functionality. But if we inspect our site and go to application under cookies, we have this Laravel session that we can delete, and if we give it a refresh, now it says welcome user because we are logged out. We don't have login functionalities as well, but we know it's working. We need to do the same thing for our navigation because if the user is logged in, we don't want to see these two links. And we can easily do that by using these directives. So if we go to our main layout, we can simply wrap this login and register with a guest directive. And if the user is logged in, they are not going to see this. So we don't have any pages right now for the logged in users, but we will create a dashboard later on. So let's do this one more time. Delete everything from users since we don't have a login functionality. And I'm going to create that user again, 321, register, back to home page. We see welcome John, and we don't see the links anymore. So the next step is to create our login page, which is quite similar to register. So let's start with our login page, and we want to start with the view. And I'm going to close everything, and inside the auth folder, we want to create a login.blade.php. So let's just copy everything from register and paste it here and change things around. For the title, we just want to say log into your account. The form route, we want to delete it because it doesn't exist. The method is the same. The classes, we don't need to change. And we, of course, need to have this CSRF token. Then we don't need a username. We do need an email. So we just want to leave it as it is. And we don't need two passwords. We just need one password field. And the button should say login instead of register. So this is kind of simpler than the register page. So let's create the controller and the routes for this one. Back to our terminal, we want to repeat the last command. And instead of register, we want to say login controller. So again, under app HTTP controllers auth, and we have our login controller. And let's create our public function here. We want to call it index, just like the register page. And we want to return a view. So this one is login page. And since we are here, let's create our login functionality too. So public function, we can call it login or create or whatever we want to. I'm just going to call it login and just die and dump. OK. Now let's go to our web.php where our routes are sitting, and we want to do the same thing here. So create a route that is a get route and goes to / login, and the controller that is going to handle it is login controller, of course. So the method is going to be index, and we want to name this one login. So I'm just going to duplicate this, change the method to post, and get rid of the name, and the method is login. Maybe we could change this one to sign up too, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so these are our routes. If we go to / login, we should see our form. And you notice we don't see our nav links because we are logged in. And in fact, we shouldn't be able to see these pages if we are logged in. And that's another issue we will address later on. For now, I'm just going to, again, delete this session so we are logged out. So let's add this to our navigation, and I can close the web.php. We don't need it anymore. And let's go to main layout and copy this route helper function and just change the name to login, and we can close it. Okay, so now we can go to register, login, and there we go. So in order to log in the user, we have to do a similar job as our register. First, we need to accept the request object. Again, it is imported already when we create our controller. Then we want to validate and then log in if successful. So for the validation, we already know what to do. We can just do the same thing as register. We want to use the validate function, use the request as the first argument, and as a second argument, we want to have an associative array where we have our email, and the rules we want to apply is that it must be an email and it is required. The next validation field is password. It is just required. There's nothing else. Now, in order to log into user, we have another method available to us. So we used auth facade in the register controller. We need to use the same thing, auth facade. Now this time, instead of log in, we want to use attempt because we don't have a valid user object at this point. We want to attempt to log in a user. And this attempt function takes an array that is basically the credentials or email password. And again, we are creating it up here. So we can save this inside a variable, let's call it credentials, and then pass that variable down here, credentials. There is a second argument that we can pass, that is the remember token, but we are not there yet. We want to see if this is successful. So we can actually wrap this inside an if statement. So if I just add if like this, and if it is successful, let's return a redirect to the home page. We want to say if this attempt to log in the user was successful, then redirect to the home page. If it was not, then failed. Because if this fails, we will automatically go to this line. So let's try that. First, without any information, we see these error messages that says these are required. Let's add an email that doesn't exist and some password. We press login, we get to the failed section. So we know the login failed, but we didn't see any proper error messages. So we can do something about it here. There is an easy way to handle that. Instead of this DD, I want to add an else block here and add a return back. So the back method, as the name suggests, it will return the user to the previous page. Now we can chain with errors method to this one, and this method takes an array with the errors we want to show. If I use password as the key here, and for the text, I just want to say incorrect credentials. And I'm using password here for a reason, and I will explain it in a moment. We want to say if this attempt was not successful, go back with errors and show this error under password field. So let's see how this works. And again, I will explain that password thing. So I want to log in with the user that doesn't exist or even a bad password. So press login, we get incorrect credentials under the password field. So when we use this error directive and we pass these names, they belong to a certain state. And when we say we want to have this message in place of the password, we are basically overriding error state for this password field. We could create a specific error state for failed credentials. For example, I want to say failed. Back in our template, instead of showing it under password, we can just copy this, and maybe right above the button, we want to show that message. So we called it failed. In other words, we gave it the key failed. So these are just keys that are available on the error state, and we are able to grab them using those keys. So let's do this again. And if I try to log in, now the error message is shown here. So this is completely preference and how you want to show the error messages. But this is basically what we need to do to log in the user. If it is successful, we will redirect back to the home page and the user is logged in. Otherwise, we will return back with errors and show this failed message. So let's test this out. Let's actually log in, 3, 2, 1, log in. We are back to home page. Now, instead of sending them to the specific route, we can use another function, and that is called intended. So in many pages, for example, you want to go to your profile and you're not logged in, you are automatically redirected to the login page. And after you logged in, you are back to the page you attempted to visit. So this is what that intended does. And by default, if the intended page is not found, it's going to go to the /. This is exactly what we want. If we wanted to go to a certain page, for example, dashboard, we could just pass it here. But we don't have this dashboard page yet, so we can just leave it as it is. All right, so that's our login functionality. So that was quite easy. Now let's address the logout functionality, which is also very easy. So I'm going to close these two files and open our main layout. We want to use the auth directives. So this is a section only for authenticated user. And I'm going to copy that div, just paste it there. And we want to have our logout button here, but we don't want to have just a simple anchor tag. This is actually needs to be a proper form that needs to be submitted through a post request, because this is also an action that needs to be protected from cross-site attacks. So instead of using an anchor tag or just a simple button, we are going to use a form, and we will have a proper route for this and a controller. So we can do this the right way. So let's create the controller first. Back to our terminal again, I will have another controller, call it logout. And inside this class, we will have only one function that is just logout. So we want to say public function logout, and let's just die and dump OK and leave it as it is. Next, we want to create a route for it. So let's go to our web, create route, and then it's going to be a post request to /logout, and the controller that is going to handle it is our logout controller, and the method we called it logout. Also, let's give it a name, logout, and that's all. So we just need a post request. We don't need any GET request because we are not showing anything except a button. So that's our route, and let's go back to our main layout and provide the action for our form. So we want to use the route helper function again. And this time we want to use the logout route. The method for this form must be post, and that means we need the CSRF token. Then we just need a button and just apply the nav link, just like these A tags. It's going to look the same. So the text should be logout, and there we go. So that's our logout button, and we are able to see it because we are logged in, and this is inside this auth directive. Again, you can see Laravel makes things very easy. With many JavaScript frameworks, you need to do all of this manually. You need to check the state of the user manually and then show different things. And that is, in my opinion, unnecessarily complicated. But with Laravel, this is all done using just one directive. Anyway, let's press logout. We will see our die and dump. So the functionality is quite easy, in fact. We just have to use that auth facade again. So it's being imported up here. And there is a logout function. That's it. Now, after we log out a user, we need to do some other steps. And I pulled up this logging out section from Laravel documentation that says when you log out the user using auth facade, it is recommended to invalidate the session and also regenerate the token. These are just for security purposes. So you can read all about it in this section, but I'm just going to copy these 3 lines and paste it here. So we want to accept the request object here, since we are using it down here, and we are invalidating our session, also regenerating the token. And instead of hard coding this path here, I'm going to use the route helper function and just pass home. So we want to redirect the user to the home page regardless of where they are. So that's all about logging out. So back to our website. We don't need this anymore down here. And if I press log out, we are logged out. That's why we see this and these links. Let's log in again, and 3, 2, 1, and log in. and log out. So everything works the way we want. Let's have some final touches on these ones. The first thing is in this login page, we don't have a remember me sections. And in many websites, you have this check mark where you can just check it and it will basically remember you for the next time you visit the page. So that's one thing. But if we log in, we could add a confirmation for the log out. We can do that in our template. So in our main, on this button, we can just add an unclick event in line and return a confirm. This is the simplest way, and just say, are you sure? All right, so this is the first step and it's quite easy. So now if I say cancel, we are not logged out. But if I say okay, we are. So this is the simplest approach. We can design this better later on. So next is that remember me token. And let's go to our database. And if we select everything from our user, you notice we have a remember me token here, which is null at the moment. And remember in our login controller, this attempt function can take a second argument that is a remember variable that is basically true or false. Does the user want to be remembered or not? That's all. So let's add this, which is very easy. So in our template, in our login template, right under password, I want to create another div, add some margin, and create an input of type checkbox. We can call this whatever we want, but I'm going to call it remember. The same thing for the ID. And then I'm going to create a label for it and just the text that says remember me. So let's go to login page. We have this text down here. And if we click, we get something. So what I'm going to do in our login page, I'm going to add that die and dump before any of this. So once again, I want to just die and dump request and maybe just add some nonsense here. Check this check mark, first login, and under request parameters, we have an array with 4 elements, and one of them is this remember, which is on. So if I actually don't check that one and inspect that parameters again, it doesn't even exist. So basically it's null. So all we have to do in our controller, inside this attempt function, we can pass that request and the name, which we called it remember, the name of that input field. So again, if that is on, then it will give us a true value. Otherwise, it's just going to be null and nothing. That's all we have to do to remember user. So let's log in with the proper user, and I'm going to check this, log in. Of course, we are logged in, but now if we check our database, so right now you can see remember token is null. But if I do it again, now the remember token is this hashed token or special string, which is kind of like the hash password. So that is how you can easily add a remember functionality to your login page. All right, so we are almost towards the end. The last thing that I want to cover is that if we go to /login manually, even though we are logged in, right, we can still go to that page. We don't want to allow that if the user is logged in. And in fact, if we had a dashboard page for our users, we wouldn't want the guest users to be able to go to that dashboard page. And let's very quickly create a dashboard page for our users. So inside the view folder, I'm going to create a dashboard page and then copy everything from home. So we don't need these directives because this page would be available only to the authenticated user. So we don't need to check if they are authenticated. And we want to say welcome username. So that's our dashboard. Let's create a controller for it because later on we will have more functionality to it. I just want to create a dashboard controller inside the controller folder itself. So not inside the auth folder. All right, so that is created. I can close the login page and the home page and the login controller. We have this dashboard now, dashboard controller, and let's say public function index that is going to return a view for us, and that is dashboard. So now let's go to our web.php to create a route for it. So right under the logout, I want to say route get, and we want to go /dashboard and use our dashboard controller inside this array. And the method, we called it index. Let's give it a name, dashboard. All right, let's keep this file open and let's add it to our navigation too. So inside these auth directives, maybe above the form, I will copy one of these A tags. This is just a simple anchor tag. And we want to go to dashboard. So let's change the text to dashboard 2. And so if we go there, we see welcome John. All right, so we want to protect these routes from guests and these routes from logged in users. We are going to use a middleware. Now, to apply a middleware to a route, we have few options. The first one is to directly use it on the route. We are logged in right now, and I don't want to be able to go to the login page. So on the login get method right here, before the name method, I can chain another method, and that is middleware. So this middleware takes the name of the middleware we want to apply, and we have built-in middlewares like auth, API, can, guest, and so on. So the one that we want right now is guest, meaning only guest users can go to the login page. All right, so that is statement right there. So let's save it and see what happens. You can see we already get 404. This is because Vite already refreshed the site for us. The reason we get a 404, if we inspect the URL, it is going to /home. Remember in the beginning of our video, we went to our service providers under app and then providers. And remember I mentioned this route service provider that is pointing to home. This is why we get a 404, because the middleware is looking at this variable and says, okay, homepage is /home, but we don't have that page. So all we have to do here, just change it to a / and we are good to go. So let's get rid of this home in the URL. And now if we try to go to login again, we are back to the home page. So in fact, let's go to our home template and get rid of this auth and also this guest directive. And let's just say welcome user, regardless of their state. So we know we are on the home page. If we go to dashboard, we say welcome John, right? And if I try to go to login, we are back to the home page. So make sure in your route service provider, this home page is pointing to the page that you want to redirect the users if there is a middleware redirecting the users. So this is one way. And I'm going to delete it because this is not the way I'm going to use. The second way is to have the middleware right inside the controller. So if we go to login controller, right above all the other functions, we can have a constructor function. As you know, a constructor function runs before any other function. So we can use double underscore and construct. And all we have to do here, grab this keyword, which refers to this class, and then use that middleware function again, pass the name that we want to use. And if you are curious, these middleware names are coming from this kernel file here. Under HTTP, we have this kernel. And if we scroll, you can see we have web, we have API, and then down here we have auth, can, guest, and so on. So this works the same way as before. So if we try to go to login again, we are back to homepage. So this is completely your preference. If you want to have your middlewares inside the controller, which I'm going to delete it again, or you can have it for routes and chain it to this function. Or what I like to do is to group everything. So these 4 routes need the middleware, right? What we can do, grab the route class again. This time we want to use a middleware function that takes the name of the middleware or middlewares we want to apply. If we had more than one, we can pass an array with different names. Then we can chain another method here, and that is a group method. So this group method takes a callback function, and in this callback function, we can group all the routes that need this middleware. So if I move this down here, now I don't have to worry about the middleware. And if I have other routes that belongs to the guests, I can just add it here. So if we try to go to register now, we are back to the home page. And that, of course, works for the login as well. And we want to do the same thing for these routes, but this time only the authenticated users should be able to visit them. So we want to, again, use the route class and middleware. This time we want to use the auth middleware. That means authenticated users can visit these routes. Then we want to group them, pass the function here, and we just want to wrap those routes with this middleware. Right now I am authenticated, so I can go to dashboard and it works fine. But let's log out. We can go to login and register. However, if I try to go to dashboard, I am back to log in. This is where that intend method comes in. In our login controller, we said intended, right? And if we actually log in, we are back to dashboard. This is the page we intended to go, but we were not logged in. And that's why we are redirected back to wherever we wanted to go. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. And we've already learned so much about Laravel, and we have a good functional registration system or authentication system in place. In the next video, we will learn even more about Laravel by creating our own model. So we will have our posts model, and we will have the migrations. We will see how we can link users and posts together and create relations between the tables in our database. And in the future videos, we will also learn about components. As I mentioned, Laravel actually has a proper component. So for example, these input fields, they could be a component. Instead of repeating ourselves multiple times, we could just use a component. But I think for now, it's good. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it has been helpful. And I want to thank you all for your views, shares, likes, subscribe, and all your support. Thanks for watching and see you at the next one. Bye bye.